This is the sixth sign in John's Gospel, and we've just read from John chapter 9, and we've read the whole chapter. And the sign tonight I've put down under the heading, Jesus brings light to the world of blind beggars. And we'll read our way through these notes, and we may just pause occasionally to make other points, but we'll do it that way. Jesus brings light to the world of blind beggars. Since the last sign, Jesus had been ministering back in Jerusalem. He'd been in the temple there preaching, and in that context he'd made this incredible statement to them saying, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." That was back in John chapter 8, verse 12. And now tonight, as we look at this sixth sign, by restoring the sight to the beggar, Jesus showed Israel and the world indeed what he'd been talking about in word, that he was indeed the light of the world. So it's a huge, wasn't a parable, but it was a huge illustration to Israel primarily, and then to the rest of the world, what he means when he says, "I'm the light of the world." Man, that is man generally, sought light apart from God in the garden by taking the fruit of the tree of knowledge, of the knowledge of good and evil. That was really a rebellion, obviously, against God, but it was coming out of that lust to find out what everything's about without having to have any reference to God. So it was an independent craving that resulted in an illusion, thinking that the things that God had made and the truth about God could be arrived at apart from God, which is a silly nonsense, obviously. But it's what's held the mind of man and the heart of man since that time. Under the illusion that knowledge of truth existed apart from communion with the Father Creator, humanity ever since has been infatuated by anyone or thing or program that claims to be able to give true light, true understanding or true knowledge, true revelation. Our Lord's claim was absolute. I am the light of the world. He was not claiming to be a light, in other words, one amongst many, or the better light, or a good light, but he was claiming to be the light. In other words, apart from him, there was no comprehension, no application of the knowledge of God anywhere. All things, you see, I've jumped a sentence. It is accommodating to modernity not to make exclusive claims about anything. If you've noticed that, obviously, as we've grown up in that period, you dare not say anything absolutely. Although it's interesting, isn't it, that the word absolutely is one of the word that's most common on the lips of people these days. It's used as a reply. You say something to them and they agree with you and they say absolutely. It's made the word into a nonsense, really. But despite that popularity of the word, if you say such a thing is absolute, then you'll have a fight. Because the human sinful spirit rises up and says, well, how dare you say something is absolute? Well, I guess if we were rising up and saying it was absolute because we said it so, that would be a valid criticism. But all things, therefore, tend to be up for grabs in the world in which we live, moral things and ethical things. The only absolute is that there are no absolutes. You criticise that absolute and you're in trouble. Arminianism, which is a kind of heresy that's been part of the church right through its history, has plagued the church and spawned within it a similar spirit, by holding to the lordship of the sinful human will over the lordship of Christ, all absolute claims about our utter need of grace are modified. Now, what I mean by that is this. If we interpret grace to mean that we set out to discover God because we've got a so-called free will, so we set out on that path, it's our initiative to do that, and so we head out and then suddenly God is there, so we've discovered him, and very graciously he then says, oh, you're forgiven. But the whole thrust of that, of course, is that one of error, because it begins with the presumption that I am free to do that. And Jesus said, I'm not. He said, if you're a sinner, you're a slave to corruption and to death, and you won't be looking for the truth. Now, we might like to talk about that later on, and I hope you'll see I haven't just dragged in a theological windmill to tilt at there, but this whole episode demonstrates the dynamics at play here. The doctrine that if we will, we can find light in ourselves to find God is commonly held and taught. This seems to honour humanity and make us accountable, but in reality it shields us from ever humbling ourselves before the sovereign grace of God. See, if it is God's grace plus my will, then there'll be a huge part of me that will never be humble before God, and thus leaves us proudly separate from the fullness of the gospel. This beggar, blind from birth, was in terrible straits. And if there's one thing that the Pharisees got mad about, so mad that it was kind of reminded me as I was preparing this of the time when the crowd turned against Stephen and basically frothed at the mouth with rage. And here tonight we see these Pharisees are moving into that kind of terrible, irrational anger against this healed man, and they eventually chuck him out of the synagogue. But behind all of that is that here's a man who was in terrible straits and he's no longer there, and Jesus is actually saying, this is something of a parable as to where you're all at. And so their hackles went up because they could see a whole different thing. Where did I get to? He was in terrible straits. There was no way that he could find healing by looking. Now that's obvious in one sense because he was blind and he'd been blind from birth. So he couldn't physically go looking for it. And he couldn't look at himself either. Or he couldn't look at anybody else because there was no help there. To say that he had the freedom of will to find true healing and wholeness was as impossible as saying that Israel could find her way to Christ through her current religious will. In other words, the point I think that Jesus is making behind all of this is that Israel, under the religion that she was operating under and in, was as blind and as derelict and as had no strength at all to actually discover the truth about God. Now, that was a judgment that Christ was bringing. As we have seen, Israel's most religious were most opposed to Christ. That's how bad her religious will was, or the whole will of her religion. Those that were the most polished in it were the most hostile to God, to Christ. As we noted in the previous signs, some saw the signs by grace, while others, thinking they already knew, or seeing something that suited their image of who Christ should be, got mad and blinded by the light, so-called, sought to destroy him. And nothing has changed. In other words, that same dynamic is as present here tonight as it was in the time of Jesus. Well, we come to the text. Jesus passing by. That struck me when I read in that opening phrase, as he passed by. What seemed like a casual, random encounter was to become a moment of surprising grace for the beggar, for his neighbours, and the disciples. It was to become a moment of surprising judgment for the Pharisees, but for the man himself and for his neighbours, they all got blown away. And the disciples could see through it too, or see through the sign to the glory too. Jesus claimed that everywhere he went, he knew the Father was working. We're commenting on the phrase, he passed by. Sounds casual, random, but everywhere Jesus went, he went knowing the Father was working. He knew that the work of the Father was to bring needy people to him. Now, if you look at those two passages in John, in 5 and 17 and 6, 37, 45, you'll see those two principles clearly enunciated by Jesus. That everything he did, he knew the Father was working. So everywhere he went, he knew the Father would bring people to him or bring him to people who were in great need. So that's what drove his life. That was the motivation for getting up in the morning and ministering, if we want to put it in those kind of psychological terms. So there was no such thing for Jesus as a fatherless encounter. So we say, or John says, he was just passing by, and it sounds like, oh, well, we better do something because we're just passing by. But it was far more than that. There's no such thing as an accidental meeting. And by the way, that's true for you and me, just as it was for Jesus. The difference between us and Jesus, I guess the question could be asked, is that how we operate? Or is it more for us, oh, I was just passing by and thought I'd do something? Which takes us into that event, you see, without any experiential theology of the Father being there and working and all of that. So then it becomes all what I can do. So Jesus passing by in the love of his Father. As he passed by, he saw, John says, a man blind from birth. We're not told how he knew he was blind from birth, whether it was just common knowledge or whether Jesus could see that, we're not told. The disciples, on the other hand, saw a theological problem. They immediately went off into what's caused it. We'll come to that. They saw this guy as a problem or a fascinating puzzle. Jesus saw a needy man as symbolic of the whole of Israel and indeed the world, ready for the mercy of his Father. By getting sidetracked into seeing a puzzle to be solved, the disciples found themselves on a different track to Jesus. He's there in his spirit saying, Father, thank you for this moment. You've brought me to this man. My heart's desire for this man is for you to show your glory to him. The disciples are saying, I wonder how he got blind. So they're out of the loop. Just by, their question wasn't wrong, or, as we'll see theologically off the planet. It was just not the way Jesus was thinking. Well, let's read on. The disciples' quandary as to who must have sinned for this man to be born blind was not unreasonable or theologically off the planet. Jesus didn't deny that sin could cause blindness, and that appendix that we looked at, I referred to earlier, you may want to go back to that and see there, again, the connection between sin and sickness and when that's helpful to make and when it's not helpful to make and all of that. It's not helpful to generalise, as the disciples did, that everything was the product of cause and effect. That was their thinking. This guy's blind, somebody must have done something wrong. You hear it today, don't you, around sickness or suffering. What have I done wrong to deserve this? Same thing. They were thinking down that pathway. But Jesus was about to show them, you can't think that way. Everything in this life is not black and white, mechanistic, cause and effect. A black and white, mechanistic interpretation of the Scriptures may in fact turn them, that is the Scriptures, into something that insulates us from the truth. They could have gone hunting for a verse and a chapter that would back up why this guy must have sinned at birth or before birth, or his parents must have sinned. But then where would they have been? They'd have still been outside of the loop of actually seeing what the Father was about to do or could do. Oversimplification and the inability to live with mystery may press us into a kind of analysis of events that takes us right away from what the Father is on about. That's a very important statement in our culture and in our world today. There is a movement amongst Christians back to a form of fundamentalism that is not healthy. A fundamentalist may be a healthy position, but it may not be. Jesus was definite about this. It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So in actual fact, he brings in a greater puzzle. He doesn't say why this guy was blind, other than this is a moment that you're going to see God at work. And he seems to imply that that's what this moment was all made for and ready for. Despite the issue of sin, personal or parental, the Father had brought this man to Jesus for his glory, the wonder of healing. I've got a quote here from Jeffrey. God, as ruler of the universe, not only takes but makes a situation such as this. Now that raises other issues that we're not going to get into tonight, but that's what Jesus said. This is for the glory of God. Blindness from birth, therefore, doesn't place this beggar outside of the glory of God or too remote from the possibility of grace. That's the beauty of the moment. Jesus says, doesn't forget about who sinned. This is going to be for the glory of God. This man is about to experience it. He's not outside of it. He's not, as the leaders would have suggested, I guess, outside the pale. God is about to act. Remember that Jesus said the chief work of God in us is that we believe. It's possible that the somewhat bizarre road to healing implemented by Jesus in this case was with a view to bringing this man to faith as well as to seeing. It's a weird one, isn't it? You know, you want to get into all of the cliches about here's mud in your eye and so on, but we won't. The light needed in his life, that is the beggar's life, was far more than just having eyes that could see. So Jesus said, you and I must work the works of him who sent me. So he's including the disciples in this whole thing, as long as it's day, because night's coming when no one can work. Jesus was constant in referring to the Father, knowing that it was the Father who sent him was both a blessing in its own right and a direction-giving thing. He knew his Father's heart, so he knew what it was to have the Father for him and with him. knowing the Father's heart also meant that he knew what and how to do things, what things to do and how to do them, like Father, like Son. His disciples were included in his ministry. We must work, he says. They too, as they watched Jesus, would be getting to know and experience the blessings and the directive wisdom of the Father. Whilst Jesus was with them, it was day, he said, because he was the light of the world. Wherever he was, the sun had risen. Wherever he went, he exposed the world. In other words, the light that he brought exposed things, exposed the world, exposed the glory of the Father, exposed the rebellion of those who thought they knew all about God apart from grace, exposed the utter helplessness of sinful humanity and the amazing newness and completeness of Father's love. That was the exposition that was happening all of the time wherever Jesus went. The day, the term day also means, we would assume, opportunity. In other words, now we have an opportunity to help this blind man, so let's not turn him into a puzzle. Let's see what God wants to do with him. Jesus was no activist, that is, a person having to be busy to feel significant or important. Such people are very dangerous people. We probably know one or three, because maybe we are one. All of us, in that sense, are probably tarred with the same brush, because all of us have problem with justification. And if we have a problem living in the full freeness of justification, then inevitably we will be doing things to impress either ourselves or others. So we're not too far from all of that. But Jesus wasn't on about that. He didn't need to be busy to feel important. Paul explained true faith action best when he said, "For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all and therefore all died." In other words, it's love that moves us, not I better feel significant or I better feel good about myself. We must be prepared to work when opportunity is given, but never to boost our sense of self-importance. All work driven by expectations of others or self-will automatically will be oblivious to what the Father is doing and the way that he does it. I'll be doing it to be impressive. Doesn't have the Father in the equation at all. So again, Jesus makes this amazing statement, "While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world," in verse 5. Again, it's an exclusive claim. In the Greek, there is no "the," it is simply "I am light." There is no other light, in other words. In Exodus 13:21 and 22, the light of God was his present glory, revealing who he was and therefore the way for his people to proceed. You remember? God set before them his presence in the day as a cloud, in the night as a fire. They looked and they saw God is with us, and that's the way we're going. In Psalm 119, verse 105, David epitomises Israel's familiar cry concerning God's word being a light to our path. They cried that out a lot. God's word is a light to our path and opens up our way. In Jesus, God's fullness of glory is present with us. It's not just a cloud, it's not just a light, it is a human being. And that human being is full of the glory of the Father. And Jesus, you remember, in John 1:18, John says the implication of him being the Word of God is that he explains God, or he explains the Father to us all. So that's his light. It's the explanation of the Father. It is the promise of the presence of the Father. And where the presence of the Father is and the explanation of the presence of the Father, there a human being comes to light or understanding the truth. All other so-called light must actually be darkness if what Jesus said is true. This is seen most clearly in our culture, where the light is taken to be what I feel and what I want. When Jesus, he now moves into the healing. When Jesus had said all of this, he spat on the ground, made clay, and applied it to the eyes of this blind beggar. So what's all of this about? Well, since the beginning of commentators, everybody disagrees about why he did this. Why didn't he just heal the man? On many occasions he did. He just said, rise up, or be strong, or be forgiven, and it happened. And the truth is, we really don't know why he did it this way. He did similar things on other occasions. There was a kind of tradition. There were two traditions. One came from the law that said spittle is unclean. It's one of the fluids of the body that's unclean. So it'll make a person who touches it unclean, ceremonially, ritually. But there was another tradition in Judaism at the time that said the spittle of the firstborn has healing properties. But the pagans also believed that around that time as well. So it's obvious that Jesus was doing more than just being trendy with the time. And doubtless he did it for other reasons. Because of the nature of this sign and the blindness of Israel, his use of clay may have been an allusion back to creation. This is just a suggestion. It was one of the 55,000. No, it's not quite as bad as that. But it was one of the lot that it gelled with me. But that doesn't mean, a hill of beans, really. Others may gel with you and but this made sense to me. Because John often refers back to the creation. He starts his epistle with a reference to the creation. But I might be drawing long straws instead of short ones to say all of that. Let me just explain. God, through his Son, had formed the first man from the earth. That's true. Was this then Christ saying to Israel and to the world, a whole new creation must happen to people's eyes if they are to see me as the light of the world? Now, I don't know, but that sounds good to me. I like that. We do see that the coating with damp clay and the washing involved the man in a simple form of obedience. He had to go and wash. Not that the man ever made much of that. He just went and did it, and then he saw. So he didn't come back saying, well, I was committed and I went to the pool and I jumped. It wasn't anything like that. It's interesting that the Pharisees were directly interested in how Jesus healed the man. In verse 15 and 19, they directly ask him twice how it happened, which may indicate that Jesus was refuting the old taboos that spittle and blood defiled a person. Carson, in his commentary, points to the nervousness of the leaders about Jesus so disrupting their old ways that the Romans would come and take away their place in the nation. So, for what it's all worth, you can work through that and read it all later and work out why you believe that Jesus made mud and put it in over the guy's eye. And then he said to him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which the word Siloam means sent. Jesus had already made much of being the Father's sent one. So it seems clear that the name of the pool refers to Christ, not the man's obedience. Let's just develop this a little bit from the rest of the scriptures. The pool of Siloam was fed by the brook Siloam, which came from the Temple Mountain or the Temple Hill. In the Old Testament, we find it stood for the blessings which flowed from God's holy habitation. If you look up, just flip with me now to Isaiah chapter 8, and the same little brook is mentioned. Don't worry about the context, you can go and check that out later. But again the Lord spoke to me, Isaiah said, saying, inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloh and rejoice in Rezin and the son of Remaliah, the Lord is about to bring on them a strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates. That was judgment that was about to come. So in the Old Testament, the brook of Shiloh stood for the blessings of God coming gently to God's people. You can check that out in Ezekiel 47:1 as well. As in Isaiah's time, the people were again rejecting the river of God, which came directly from God's dwelling place. Jesus was claiming to be the true Siloam, in whom all blind sinners must go to be healed. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. Don't you just love the way John talks about the outcome of these signs often? Again, his economy of description just highlights the quality of the wonderful change. He went away, he washed, and he saw. Therefore the neighbours and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? They couldn't believe that this was the same guy. The man's whole appearance had changed so much that some thought it was a different person. Now, maybe it was easier for them to believe that this was a different person than it was for them to believe that God could do something so wonderful, that it would transform not just the ability of the optic nerve to work again, but the whole outward demeanour of the person. But he kept saying, I'm the one. It's a lovely, free and funny little scene, isn't it? They're saying, who is it? Oh, maybe he's a phony. I'm the one, he's saying. He was caught up in it, as you would expect. All this directed people to the fullness of the Father's blessing in the kingdom, that is, if they would. It directed him to it, I'm the one. And he worshipped by saying, I'm the one. Others, well, some of them got it, some of them didn't. Christ knows only one way the Father blesses, and that is full bore. There's only total transformation to be looked for with joy. That's what this is saying to us. We might be blind like this beggar, but God has something for us that totally transforms and will totally transform, and that transformation will last. The worship of the beggar was spontaneous and free in his repeated cries, I'm the one. The staggering transformation of grace was most amazing to him. Nothing would ever stop his mouth from singing and adoring the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ. The fullness of that worship we're going to see was triggered later again by Jesus as he met him after the Pharisees had run over him with their D9s. Well, a little postscript to pick up these last moments after the sign had happened. The Lord is not spoken of again till he met the man after he had been interrogated by the Pharisees and excommunicated from the synagogue. Immediately after the healing, the Pharisees grilled him. You can read that in verse 13 to 34. This grilling also included the man's parents. The sign had divided the leaders. Some insisted that if Jesus was from God, he would observe the Sabbath. Others said that the sign indicated he was from God. So there was and, as there always will be, division. Where the light shines, the shadows are deepened. That's just a physical principle, but it's spiritually true as well. Dormant water, with the warmth of the sun, soon becomes stagnant and stinking. When asked what he felt about Jesus, the healed man said, well, he's a prophet, which was a progression from verse 11 where he just said, oh, well, he's called Jesus. So this guy's growing and expanding in his understanding. In a few minutes' time, he's going to meet with this same Jesus and things are going to expand even more. His parents were brought into the debate. Now, we just need to focus here for a minute and see a contrast between the two regimes. There's the kingdom of the Pharisees that they're trying to hold on to. Jesus is coming and the light is showing them up to be in the darkness. But they desperately want to hold on. So the only mechanism they've got for holding on to people is fear. So they grill the parents. And the parents know that if they say the wrong thing here, then they're out. Now, to be out of the synagogue was not just, oh, well, we'll go to the one down the road. We'll go to the Baptists on the hill or the Anglicans down in the valley or something. Usually the Catholics are on the hill, but anyway, it doesn't matter. To be excommunicated from the synagogue was to be cut off socially, economically, every way you think, religiously. So it was a big deal, and they were scared. That was the thing that motivated the Pharisees, control through fear. They didn't have any light, so they weren't propelled by love, so they were propelled by fear, and they engendered fear wherever they spoke. Let's come back to the notes. The fear regime that surrounded the kingdom of the Pharisees was crippling. To confess, to confess Jesus would mean exclusion. The power that the Pharisees exercised was one of exclusion compared to the inclusive ministry of Jesus. The second time they called the healed man, I love this. This is a wonderful little exchange. A great exchange took place. He, now like Jesus, could see their refusal to see and listen. He said to them, when they grabbed him the second time, I already told you, but you didn't listen. Now, I don't think that was so much a frustration. It was a kind of incredulous thing. I've been healed. I've told you. You've seen me. You know that I used to be blind. So suddenly he's now seeing that opposition is not just a matter of, I don't understand the words that you're using, but the opposition is coming right from the belly, the heart, which is against God and against his Son. So he's broken into Jesus' world. And like Jesus said, if you come with me, you'll feel the opposition I feel. So that's what was going on. He now, like Jesus, could see their refusal to see and listen. His heart eyes had been opened too. With the innocence of purity, the man asked them if they too wanted to become disciples of Jesus. I don't think he was just being a smart aleck there. Their cynicism was met with a logic. In other words, the Pharisees' cynicism he met with a logic of experience and grace. It was then that they fell back to derision, trying to breed what? Fear. And that came out of their insecurity. They reviled him, terrible word, looked down on him and sneered. This guy's put through it. They said, you're his disciple, but we're disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, Don't even know where he's from. And then the man gives his first sermon. He's been a beggar for 38 years. Hadn't gone to college. Not that college is a bad thing, but this guy, he's full of the Spirit of Christ. And his remarks bore the wisdom of Christ. Christ had promised, you remember, when they hand you over to the leaders and to the rulers, don't worry about how or what you are to say, for it'll be given to you in that hour what you are to say. That's in Matthew 10:19. Well, this guy is a classic illustration of that. His answer was not smart, but wise. It was not designed to win an argument, but to witness to the truth, to bear the light of God into the situation. And he's going to discover that the more the light of God is brought into that darkness, the more it stinks. It causes the darkness to concentrate, and it causes the fetid water to get even more stinking. So he's in the battle. He's right in the middle of it. So the man answered and said to them, well, here's an amazing thing, that you don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. We all know that God does not hear sinners, so he can't be a sinner because he opened my eyes. But if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, God hears him. So this man must be doing God's will. Since the beginning of time, it's never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. This is a wonderful statement, isn't it? Logical and clear, but not smart aleck. The shame-driven anger of the Pharisees rose to breaking point. Still viciously linking the man's blindness with his, they excommunicated him from the synagogue. This was no small matter. Hearing of the man's situation, Jesus deliberately sought him out. There's a beautiful last paragraph to this whole story. Jesus knew what it was to go through the grill of the Pharisees. He didn't just glide through it either. He felt it. He felt their derision, and he knew this man would have felt their derision. And a very beautiful blooming of faith occurs as Jesus meets up with him again. Jesus heard that they'd put him out, and finding him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he said, "Who is he, Lord, that I might believe in him?" And then this very beautiful penny-dropping moment. Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and he's the one who is talking with you." And he said, "Oh Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. Suddenly the experience of healing was linked with the Father's only begotten Son standing in front of him. His faith spontaneously translated into worship. There's no other way, really. Anything else we would call worship that doesn't spontaneously arise out of that kind of faith is not worship. But then, suddenly, the mood changes again. Christ has healed this man now completely, but his final words were really frightening. He said, "For judgment I came into this world, so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Now, what did he mean by that? The first part seems to be obvious, because the blind man was a good illustration of that. I came in so that those who do not see may see. What did he mean when he said those who see may become blind? He was talking, obviously, of those who felt that they saw everything and didn't need him. And he said, if you reject me in that spirit, you will be sealed into that blindness. Terrible thing. Terrible, terrible thing. And it ought to bring us to weeping, as it does. And Jesus said to them, they then said to him, the Pharisees said to him, "We're not blind too, are we?" There's a terrible, casual, rebellious indifference sometimes to the presence of Jesus and his loving word. And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you wouldn't have any sin. In other words, you wouldn't be culpable. But since you say, we see, and you don't see, your sin remains. Go to that last sentence there. A sinner cannot be released from unconfessed sin, however much they claim they have been or can be. In other words, you hear many sinners saying, well, I don't feel guilty. It's not the point, really. God says you're guilty, and so we're guilty. Well, that's a bit of a down note to finish on, but let's pause for prayer, and we'll then go and have some supper together.